There are very few things in the United States that all of us agree on, but 95% of Americans believe that cigarette smoking is harmful, and more than 75% of Americans have no trust or little trust in tobacco companies. So, what would you think if I told you that 68% of the food that you put in your lunchbox or your child's lunchbox wasn't created by a food company or a food researcher, but in fact, a tobacco company that had paid scientists to find a way to make the foods you put in your everyday lunches addictive so you couldn't stop eating them? Would you still trust those companies that put that food in your child's lunchbox? Let's get into it. A new study that came out from the University of Kansas this past year went and took a deep dive looking at uncovered records from tobacco company research coupled with new research into addiction strategies and how companies can utilize certain strategies to trigger addictions in their consumers. There was evidence mounting during the late 80s that was pointing in the direction of significant crackdowns on cigarette and tobacco-related product use. And the tobacco companies saw the writing on the wall and sought to diversify their portfolio to ensure that they still had long-term financial success. That came about when they made a massive, and I mean massive, investment in Kraft Foods Company at Philip Morris and at Nabisco at R.J. Reynolds, two of the largest tobacco companies in the world. In 1988, Philip Morris bought Kraft Foods for $12.9 billion. Now, that is not adjusted for inflation. It was one of the largest acquisitions of all time at that point. Now, in the decades leading up to 1988, tobacco companies had spent tens of millions of dollars each year paying scientists to research ways to make their products more addictive. They researched flavor profiles, they researched brain activity, bliss response, and reward centers in the brain, and flavor profiles that were most likely to trigger those alarm bells that would keep American consumers coming back and needing those cigarettes over and over again in an addictive way. When they sought to enter the food industry, they very quickly adapted that research and put it together to put it to work on food products, creating that exact same bliss reward trigger in the brain by finding a very unique combination of flavors that didn't exist in nature that triggered the reward system in our brain. And that equation was sugar plus fat plus salt equals addictivity. They call it hyperpalatable food items. Now, prior to 1988, hyperpalatable food items really didn't exist in the consumer marketplace. You couldn't find them because they weren't flavor profiles that were easy to put together unless you used chemicals and ultra processed them to force these flavors together. But starting in 1988, they became readily available with a fervor. Like they just started rolling out one after another after another. And today, many of the foods that you put in your child's lunchbox or even your own lunchbox were actually created back then and are still using the exact same ultra processed equation and reward center mechanisms that they researched to make sure that you couldn't stop eating them. These researchers at the University of Kansas published their findings in the Journal of Addiction, and it found that from 1988 to 2001, when R.J. Reynolds owned Nabisco, they crafted Oreo cookies, Teddy Grahams, Ritz crackers, and Snackwell's fat-free Devil's Food cookies, while Philip Morris during that time frame owned Kraft General Foods, and they invented Kraft mac and cheese, Jell-O, Kool-Aid, Oscar Mayer hot dogs, and a host of other products. The research study published here in the Journal of Addiction took 105 hyperpalatable foods that were crafted by tobacco companies and put it up alongside 587 food products that were not created by tobacco companies during that same time frame. And what they found was a staggering result. The study found that foods that were created by Big Tobacco were 29% more likely to have a fat sodium hyperpalatability, while they were 80% more likely to have a carbohydrate sodium heavy hyperpalatability. What that means is that almost all of the foods that were released by Big Tobacco during the time frame of 1998 to the early aughts was designed to addict American consumers to this very unhealthy, ultra-processed, reward center equation-focused style of food. One of the biggest concerns is that contained within this equation of specific types of food production are this trigger in the reward center of your brain that sets off little alarm bells, and it stops your brain from processing how full you are, so you can't stop eating the foods. Then they put to work their expert marketing techniques, where they used to try and sell cigarettes with cartoon characters and sleek marketing campaigns, and they put those same marketing efforts to work on products, with a good example being Teddy Grahams. They convinced everybody that Teddy Grahams were this delicious, healthy, wholesome snack, and they put those words all over the box. They made you believe it was made from graham flour that was whole grain and whole wheat, because it was in there. Exactly 1% of it was in there, or just 2 grams of graham flour in a 1-ounce serving. They also made adult versions of that in Honey Made Honeycomb graham snacks, and they convinced all of us that these were healthy foods when in fact they had been ultra processed and ultra refined, which means they'd taken out almost all of the nutrients and added back in chemical synthetic nutrients, convincing us that we were feeding our kids something that was healthy, wholesome, good for them, and tasted great. But in reality, it was anything but. Snackwell's cookies was another great example. Okay, these were fat-free cookies that had been ultra processed to remove all of the fat while still tasting salty, sweet, and a little bit fatty, because it was loaded with chemical additives that convinced our brains that's what we were tasting. What ended up happening is it actually led to something called the Snackwell's effect, where it would cause your brain to binge eat them, and even though they were low in fat or no fat, were loaded with calories, and you were actually increasing your caloric intake because you could not stop eating them, and people were likely to binge eat a whole box or more at a time. One of the largest comparable issues that arose during the exact same time frame is that between 1988 and 2012, we saw a 74% increase in the rise of metabolic disease related to diet in America. Metabolic syndrome is the direct contributor that leads to an increase in obesity, diabetes, stroke, and heart disease in America, translating to 4 of the largest killers of adults and children at this point in the United States. In addition to showing a direct correlation with the increase of all of those metabolic syndromes and their effects, it also shows that all hyperpalatable foods intentionally promote cravings. And what that means is, regardless of whether they are low fat, low sugar, ultra processed, or unprocessed, you're going to have an increase in caloric intake because you can't stop eating them. Your body doesn't recognize fullness, and you feel compelled to eat more and more of the food, no matter what part of the dietary spectrum it falls on or has been chemically altered to fall on. Ashley Gerhardt, a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, broke it down like this. Every addictive substance is something we take from nature, and we alter it, process it, and refine it in a way that makes our brain trigger a reward response. And it very clearly is what happened with these hyperpalatable food substances. We treat these foods like they come from nature. Instead, they're foods that come from big tobacco. Even though big tobacco exited the food industry in approximately 2007 to 2012, depending on which brand was exiting, today studies find that 69% of all of our foods are hyperpalatable. It's actually difficult to track down a food that is not hyperpalatable and ultra-processed, and foods that aren't, such as fruits and vegetables, are not just hard to find, they're far more expensive, so it's harder for us to get our hands on them. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would food companies want to keep us sick? Well, look at their top investors, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. 30.4 million people die each year worldwide of chronic disease. Chronic disease is defined as something that is not contagious. It's not prevented by vaccines. It's not cured by medication. It's developed over time. It's long-lasting, and it never just disappears. Each year, Americans spend more than $3 trillion on healthcare, but between 50 and 75% of that spending is specifically related to lifestyle-related decisions and preventable illnesses or conditions. The more we eat, the more medicine we need. And then ask yourself who the largest investors are in Big Pharma. Like for part 2, because I'm going to do a deep dive into how Big Tobacco bought a bunch of sugary drinks companies and then engaged in a years-long campaign of marketing to ensure that the hyperpalatability of them kept us drinking them addictively, while paying off nonprofits to withdraw their opposition to any litigation or legislation that would have contested their dominance in the marketplace or questioned the health benefits of those drinks. Here, my name is Tiffany. We work together to fight mega corporations, private equity firms, and save small businesses in our community. And today, to eat a little bit healthier. If you're new here, don't forget to like, follow, and do all the things, and stick around.